Welcome, travelers. Tonight you and I take a little stroll through the less than glorious reality of medieval assassins, the figures history prefers to leave lurking in the shadows. Forget the hooded parkour experts of video games and the cool, smooth-talking killers of Hollywood. The truth? Well, sharpen your skepticism and maybe your sense of humor, because being a medieval assassin was about as glamorous as mucking out a plague cart. Before you get cozy, hit that like button and subscribe if you get a kick out of history kicking you back. And just for fun, drop a comment letting me know where and when you're watching from. I want to know which time zones are up late, risking existential dread with me. Now turn down those lights, maybe let a draft in for that authentic medieval chill, and let's get honest about the world's least enviable job. Let's get something straight. No one in the Middle Ages ever leapt out of bed on a frosty morning thinking, "Ah, yes, what I truly crave in life is to jab a baron in the spleen for a handful of coins, then spend the weekend hiding in a dung heap." Becoming an assassin wasn't a dream, it was the final stop on the life has gone spectacularly wrong express. Most assassins weren't mysterious loners who trained atop windswept peaks. They were the people society forgot. Ex-soldiers drummed out of the ranks, petty thieves who could climb a wall, beggars with nothing left but a mean streak, or the sort of folks who could vanish from the census, and not even their mothers would notice. If you had wealth, you hired an assassin. If you had a title, land, or even a halfway decent cow, you sent someone else to do the dirty work. But if you'd been in prison more recently than you'd seen a hot meal, congratulations. Someone was about to slide a battered coin purse your way, along with a name no one wanted to know and a job description that boiled down to come back or don't. And let's be honest, you weren't being asked to take out Mildred the sheep wrangler. No, your mark was always the kind of person who collected enemies like other people collected lice, corrupt bishops, cruel barons or warlords surrounded by enough muscle to staff a small army. The pay was tempting, the odds appalling, and by the time you considered the offer, you'd already lost family, friends, and any hope of a dental plan. Oh, the perks, there were none. No retirement, no tales sung in your honor, no evenings off, except the sort where you lie awake in a hayloft, listening for footsteps and wondering if the fleas will be the death of you before the city watch. There was no sign above your door that read discreet problem-solving by appointment. You kept your mouth shut, your head down, and you never ever told anyone what you did, especially not while sloshing ale at the local inn. Me? Oh, I trade carpets. The stains? Don't ask. So no, you didn't dream of the assassin's life. You landed there because the world had chewed you up, spat you out, and left you wearing a hood and clutching a blade that might not even be yours. You weren't the hero, you weren't really the villain either. You were the footnote, the shadow that made everyone nervous at night and never lived long enough to enjoy the coin. Let's bust the first myth like a rotten barrel. Medieval assassins weren't trained in ancient mountain temples by bearded senses with a fondness for cryptic wisdom. There was no montage, no candles, no whispered words of encouragement. If you learned anything, it was by not dying on your first job, and even that was a coin toss. Realistically, most assassins were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the basic skill of climbing a wall without immediately sneezing. If you'd served in the military, fantastic. You understood which end of a knife was which. If not, well, stabbing wasn't the tricky part. Surviving long enough to spend your pay. Now that was the real test. There were no handbooks, no shadowy guilds with helpful PowerPoints, and certainly no Assassin 101 orientation. You didn't get lessons on how to spot a decoy or memorize noblemen's escape routes. You figured it out the hard way, dangling from a windowsill at midnight, praying you weren't about to drop into the laundry instead of the Lord's bedchamber. And then there's poison. Ah, the glamorous tool of the assassin, unless of course you were the unlucky soul learning by trial and error, accidentally spicing your own soup with hemlock. Sometimes it worked, sometimes your target just complained of indigestion and became even more suspicious. Sometimes you wound up the one face down in the porridge, victim of a mix-up a medieval poison control wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. If you were colossally lucky, you might have learned a trick or two from thieves or mercenaries, a whispered tip about which alleyway squeaked less, or which roofs were safest. Maybe, just maybe, a veteran assassin took pity on you and gave you a quick rundown on walking softly. But let's not kid ourselves. Mentoring was rare and never lasted long. Assassins didn't retire. They vanished, one way or another. As for weapons, forget the swordplay you see on screen. You weren't striding into a castle with a glinting broadsword strapped across your back. You had a dagger, probably borrowed from a guard who no longer needed it, or a bit of wire if you fancied yourself subtle. Whatever you carried, it had to fit under a cloak and not jingle with every nervous step. So no, you weren't a shadowy martial artist. You were a grubby, nervous survivor with a questionable relationship with alleyways and a knack for not being seen. Success didn't come from style or training. It came from being just lucky enough to run faster than the next guy and vanish before anyone could sketch your mug for a wanted poster. Your education was a brutal, hands-on affair. No diploma, just a collection of bruises, bloodstains, and the creeping realization that you were, as always, alone. Now, let's talk motivation. Why did you take the job? Simple. Coin. Cold, hard, clinking coin. The currency of hope for the hopeless. Or at least that's what you told yourself while counting imaginary riches. Because the reality, you got paid in lies. When someone hired an assassin, they weren't looking for a lifelong partnership. They wanted a one-time service, no questions, no receipts, and ideally, no witnesses, especially not you. You might be offered a pouch of silver, half now, half when the job's done. If your client was feeling generous, that is. But here's the catch. When the job's done really meant when we're sure you didn't mess up, get caught, make us look bad, or live long enough to tell anyone what happened. You did the job, crept through the shadows, maybe even managed to dispatch a noble in his sleep. No poetry, no heroics, just sweat, fear, and a little bit of luck. You'd return for your payment, only to find your client had vanished into the night. Terribly sorry, unforeseen business. Or worse, they try to tie up loose ends, and suddenly you're fighting for your life against the people who hired you. After all, a knife is cheaper than a bonus. Even if you did get paid, it was never enough. Not for the risk, not for the blood, not for the 3 days spent hiding in a haystack with only lice and guilt for company. You walked away with a handful of coins, a nod, and a reminder that you were never here. Sometimes the contract itself was a lie, a political trap, set by rivals eager to catch a would-be assassin. You'd be sent after a mark, only to discover the target surrounded by soldiers waiting for you with rope and gallows at the ready. Congratulations, your name was already carved into the scaffold. And even when the job was real, you couldn't exactly sue for breach of contract. Your Honour, I'd like to file a complaint against Lord Geoffrey for non-payment of illicit services. The only court you'd ever see was the one where you were the main attraction, swinging gently in the breeze. So you learned to take what you could, demand payment up front, and trust absolutely no one. Not the client, not their sly-eyed scribe, not even the weather. Every job was a gamble that mostly paid out in regret. Being a medieval assassin meant living on broken promises, hiding from everyone, and vanishing before the lies caught up to you. No glory, no perks, and certainly no happy endings, unless you count being forgotten as a kind of peace. So next time you see a black-hooded figure in a tapestry, remember, behind every shadow is a story of desperation, double crosses, and the kind of job security that only comes if no one remembers your name. But of course, that's just the start, because you haven't even seen the tools, the targets, the disguises, and the sheer crushing loneliness that comes with the gig. So you've taken the job, now what? Let's see what you're really in for. So you've signed on for the deadliest gig in medieval HR? Congratulations. You've just been handed a future filled with broken promises, abysmal pay, constant paranoia, and a statistically significant chance of being hanged by lunchtime. Welcome to the Assassin's Toolkit. Spoiler alert, it looks nothing like the collector's edition you saw in the game trailer. Let's take inventory. There are no retractable gadgets, no magical daggers that whisper in Elvish, and definitely no smoke bombs tucked up your sleeve for dramatic exits. What you have is what you can steal from a distracted butcher, scavenge from a battlefield, or find in the pocket of yesterday's corpse. If fortune grins, you might possess a dagger, not the kind that's jewel-encrusted or curves like a dragon's fang, but a chipped, utilitarian blade that hopefully doesn't reek of spoiled fat. Poison? Yes, it existed. And no, it wasn't as refined as a slow drip into a crystal goblet. Most medieval poisons were as much a gamble as a dice game with loaded bones, sourced from questionable plants, suspicious minerals, or the innards of a toad that died looking surprised. These brews were unreliable at best. Sometimes they killed instantly. Sometimes they left your target bedridden and vomiting for a week, only to recover angrier and now very suspicious of you and your stew. Rope, the medieval multi-tool. You could strangle, climb, or tie down with it, but success depended on how quickly you could remember which knot actually worked. Nothing says failed assassin like an awkward wrestling match with a struggling target and a slip knot you learned from a shoemaker. Bows, useful, if you had a lifetime to practice, arms like a miller and the patience of a saint. But don't think you'll waltz into a palace gig disguised as a flower arranger with a long bow slung nonchalantly. Most hits went down face to face. No elegant marksmanship, just panic, blood, and the hope you don't trip over your own boots. You don't get a backup. If your blade snaps, or if you drop it down a privy, congratulations, you're improvising. Slate tile, rusty nail, shoe buckle. The world is your armory, provided you're desperate enough to weaponize lunch leftovers. Hide your tools anywhere you can, sewn into boots, stitched into cloaks, or tucked into a hollowed-out loaf of bread. You don't keep them for comfort. You keep them because they're the only friends who won't betray you, unless they break mid-job, in which case you can add abandoned by inanimate objects to your growing list of complaints. No upgrades, no tinkering, no time to polish. You pray your tools get you through the night, because in this business, the only thing deadlier than your weapons is your own desperation. If anyone's performing miracles, it's you, armed with a spoon, a handful of hope, and a prayer that nobody's paying attention. Let's talk about your targets. You're not being paid to eliminate random beggars or the local drunk who sings too loudly after curfew. Your contracts are for the big fish, nobles, bishops, high-ranking officers, even royalty. These people are as easy to reach as the last slice of bread at a famine feast. First, the guards. Not one, not two, but sometimes dozens, armed, well-fed, and bored enough to notice anything out of place. Some block the main entrance, some lurk by the back stairs, and others just stand around flexing their intimidating scowls. Your new hobby? Memorizing patrol routines, counting how many steps before the wheezing sentry takes a break, and learning which floorboard creaks loudest at midnight. Next, the walls. Castles weren't built with convenience in mind. They come with moats full of things that bite, arrow slits perfect for disaster, and boiling oil just waiting for an excuse to ruin your week. If you survive a swim in the moat, you still have to dodge archers and hope the night's cook isn't feeling suspiciously helpful. And then the staff. Kitchens, stables, endless corridors, each one crawling with servants who have nothing better to do than gossip. You're not just sneaking past swords, you're ducking medieval rumour mills. And let me assure you, news of a strange face travels faster than fleas at a dog show. Finally, your actual target. Paranoid doesn't begin to cover it. These folks have relatives who'd kill for half their inheritance, sleep testers for the wine, and a healthy distrust of anything that moves. Some sleep in decoy beds. Some lock their doors with 3 bolts. Others rotate rooms like it's a deadly game of musical chairs. A feast sounds like an opportunity. Right? Wrong. While everyone's drunk, so are you. Because blending in means drinking with the crowd. Good luck slipping past the guard captain, 3 overzealous hounds, a perpetually awake jester, and a hall full of witnesses clinging to their tankards like lifelines. Getting close can take weeks. You might pose as a servant, bribe the laundress, or crouch in a barrel for hours. When the moment comes, you have one chance, one silent, flawless, ghostly strike. If you miss, expect your next public appearance to be as a cautionary example, swinging from the castle gate, with a sign that reads, "Nice try." Now let's shatter the fashion myth. You're not striding through moonlit gardens in sleek midnight black robes with an artfully shadowed hood. You look like a goat herder who lost a fight with a mud puddle. Disguises in the Middle Ages were less tailored espionage and more please don't notice me chic. No custom cloaks, no clever armour, no secret pockets sewn by a master thief. Just whatever you could lift from the laundry line or borrow from a sleeping monk. Peasant rags, a robe so enormous you could camp under it, or a guard's tunic that still carries the aroma of last week's midnight shift. You blend in by looking as unremarkable as everyone else, unwashed, limping, with a nervous gaze honed by chronic malnutrition. You don't look suspicious because of your ragged cloak. You look suspicious because you keep fidgeting, trying to keep your dagger from clattering against your thigh or poking through your bread roll. Forget about masks, no dramatic face coverings, no Guy Fawkes options, just the occasional dirty rag wrapped around your nose, which mostly makes you look like someone with a contagious skin condition. Good for avoiding chatty strangers, terrible for sneaking into noble feasts. If anyone asks who you are, you improvise. I'm Brother Tobias, here for silent prayer and roof repairs. The less convincing you sound, the more likely you are to find yourself knocked unconscious with a candlestick by a suspicious scullery maid. Even if you slip past the guards, noble households run on memory. The cook knows everyone, the stable boy remembers every face, and the maid will notice if you can't name the cat. You're always one who are you again from disaster. Should your disguise work, congratulations. You've bought yourself maybe 5 awkward minutes. Now you have to pretend you belong here without making eye contact with anyone who actually does. Wigs, not a chance. If you need to look older or younger, you rub dirt on your face, try squinting convincingly, and hope no one gets close enough to notice the beard you glued on with honey. Disguises don't save you. At best, they buy you confusion and a moment's head start. If you're caught, may the saints have mercy. Nobody wants to be discovered in the bishop's laundry room, wrapped in a nun's habit and holding a sword, especially not on a holy day. Now for the real secret. In medieval times, you're utterly alone. No band of brothers, no clever sidekick bantering by torchlight, no handler sending cryptic notes or offering encouragement. You, your questionable blade, and a mountain of trust issues. Guilds? Mostly a myth, spread by drunkards and desperate playwrights. If there's a brotherhood of assassins, it's more likely a handful of freelancers who'd sooner sell you out than split a coin. You're about as likely to meet a friendly colleague as you are to stumble across a unicorn playing dice. Why all the isolation? Because in this business, every extra soul who knows your face is another pair of lips waiting to betray you. Even your employer doesn't know your real name, and if they do, you're already plotting your exit. Companionship? Forget it. Friends ask too many questions. Lovers notice bloodstains, mysterious bruises, and why you never sleep without a weapon under your pillow. Settling down is a luxury you'll never afford. One slip, one wrong glance in the market, and your life becomes a sprint, punctuated by terrified glances over your shoulder. Other criminals keep their distance. Thieves and smugglers might share a drink. But you're the one who makes people vanish, and nobody wants to be the next accidental vanishee. Nobody shares stew with a walking liability. No one's offering sympathy either. Try telling someone how hard it is to sleep after a job, and they'll assume you're either lying or dangerous, which of course you are. So you keep your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. At the inn, you're the one hunched in the darkest corner, back against the wall, surveying every doorway for trouble. You never drink too much. You never stay more than a night. Your name is whatever the situation demands, and even then it's probably not the one your mother gave you. Being a medieval assassin isn't about glory, upgrades, or a retirement plan. It's about perfecting the art of vanishing, not just in crowds, but from every life you'll never get to live. No one will remember your face. No one will mourn your passing. You are the shadow that history forgets, and frankly, you wouldn't last a week. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You've assembled your sorry kit, chosen your disguise, and steeled yourself for the loneliness. Now comes the real test, surviving the job itself. And as you'll soon see, the stakes are much higher and harsher than any legend ever dared to tell. Let's say you took the job. Let's imagine you accepted the contract. You mapped out every alley, memorized guard rotations, slipped a little something to the right sentry, and disguised yourself as a chimney sweep, so convincing you almost believed it yourself. But then the crucial moment arrived, and your body betrayed you. Perhaps your marks spun around without warning, or they were unexpectedly joined by a giggling child, or maybe your nerves frayed, and your weapon quivered in your grip like a startled ferret. Guess what? There's no do-over. You're not getting a stern talking to or a bad review. In medieval assassination, failure meant center stage, the grandest, bloodiest performance the city could muster, and you, friend, were the main attraction. Expect a dramatic, agonizing spectacle. Ropes, flames, wheels, or some contraption that sounds like a rejected carnival ride, the bone cracker's delight. Missing the kill didn't just mean you failed, it meant the entire operation burst into flames. Your target survived, immediately sounding the alarm. Suddenly, your shadowy anonymity is replaced by a hasty, lopsided sketch, tacked up in every tavern for 30 miles. And those sleepy guards, now they're on a mission, fueled by a sudden desire to be heroes, or at least to not be the next victim. And don't get too comfortable blaming only the authorities. Sometimes the most dangerous threat wasn't your intended victim, but the very person who hired you. After all, a failed assassin is only useful as a cautionary tale. You're now a liability, a potential leaky barrel of secrets, ready to spill under the right amount of pain or creative medieval persuasion. The people who paid you will be the first to commission your immediate and permanent retirement with prejudice. Second chances? Not in this business. There's no "my bad, slipped on a chicken bone. Let's try again tomorrow." You're given a solitary shot. If you miss, your best outcome is a quick end before anyone finds out who bankrolled your little adventure. And beyond pain, there's the silent, rotting shame. You didn't just fail a job, you failed to be invisible. You failed at the one thing that separated you from the mob: perfection. Anything less than flawless execution painted a target right between your shoulder blades. No one cared about your previous exploits. You could have successfully dispatched a dozen high-profile nobles. It didn't matter. In this trade, you're only as good as your latest kill, and if that kill didn't happen, your new skill set is running. So let's say you pull it off. The plan unfolds like clockwork. The blade meets its mark. No noise, no guards, just one very important corpse cooling on the floor. Congratulations, your prize. A frantic sprint through alleyways, someone else's blood now decorating your boots, and a mangy dog already picking up your scent. Don't expect a rooftop toast city in flames behind you. Cinematic slow motion. No, you're bolting through streets choked with refuse and suspicion. There's no celebratory drink, no debrief, no thank you note from your client. You don't even get a moment to admire your handiwork. The second your weapon does its job, your new mission launches. Evade the avalanche of people now bent on ending your story in increasingly creative and painful ways. Guards are flooding the streets, doors are being barred, horses inconveniently stationed at the opposite end of the city. You're probably bleeding too, because in this line of work, even a perfect kill can leave you with a parting gift. You had to plan your escape before the hit. Routes, disguises, fallback hideouts. Maybe you paid off a boatman, or at least found one who didn't ask questions. Because when a high-profile murder rocks the city, the gates slam shut, soldiers prowl every corner, and your mugshot featuring a heroic unibrow and a note reading, possibly armed and extremely stabby, is now standard issue for every man with a sword. And let's not forget your client. Even if they intend to pay, you won't be meeting for drinks at the local tavern. They'll disappear into the shadows, because a successful assassin is now the most dangerous person in town. You know too much. You've proven you can go where no one else can. So even as you stuff your ill-gotten coins into a hole in your cloak, you understand you're also stuffing a target onto your own back. What's your reward? A glorious week spent sleeping in haylofts, bribing ferrymen, shaving in the dark and answering to Brother Lucian, while you shuffle along with monks headed east. Because murder for hire doesn't mean a happy ending, it means starting the game all over in a new city, under a new name, with even more people looking for you. So yes, you made the hit. Now run like your life depends on it, because it does. If you thought the life of a medieval assassin couldn't get more miserable, congratulations. You've underestimated the Middle Ages. You're not just poor, hunted, and perpetually smelling of goat. You're also the subject of everyone's least favourite bedtime story. To medieval minds, assassins weren't just criminals. You were an abomination. Someone who consorted with demons, smeared frog guts on blades beneath a full moon, and whispered unholy incantations as you slipped through shadows. Why else could you bypass guards and vanish into the night? Logic, of course, was a rare commodity. Superstition? That was the real currency. Some believed assassins could shapeshift at will. Others swore you were invisible unless doused in holy water. There were tales that you'd made pacts with forest spirits and could kill with a glance through a stone wall. Imagine trudging through a village and overhearing an old woman mutter, "Don't look at him, he'll hex the baby." Even your tools were taboo, carrying a dagger, clearly forged in a cursed smithy, using poison, not chemistry but witchcraft, probably brewed with a dried toad and a sprinkle of moonlight. You might think this reputation worked in your favor. Surely people would avoid you, right? If only. In reality, superstition made things exponentially worse. Mobs don't pause to fact-check. They don't form committees. They grab pitchforks, light torches and shout, "Burn him before he calls down a plague." Your notoriety ensures every random misfortune, unexpected illness, accident, drunk noble choking on a chicken bone, is blamed on the shadowy stranger who passed through 2 nights ago. Just existing in the same county as a suspicious death can put you on the wrong end of a pointed stick. So you keep moving, always. Linger too long, and the local priest is ringing his bell, while a half-dozen angry farmers form a welcoming committee, pitchforks gripped like they've been rehearsing this moment for years. Heaven help you if you're caught with anything even remotely odd. Dried herbs, foreign coins, or saint's preserve us a mysterious accent. That's all it takes for someone to shout sorcerer and start hunting for dry firewood. In an age that believed monsters wore human faces, being quiet, clever, or simply too quick on your feet was reason enough to be feared, and in medieval logic, fear was best dealt with by a short, sharp, and preferably fiery end. Ah, the supposed glory of the assassin's legacy, a tale of whispered infamy, shadowy triumph, and eternal mystery, right? Well, let's drag that daydream out into the cold, hard light of reality. You think you're leaving a mark on history? Get ready to watch that mark scrubbed away faster than a tavern spill in front of a rent-hungry landlord. Let's say you've just pulled off the job of a lifetime. The contract is finished. The noble, the rival, the inconvenient bishop gone, all thanks to you. For one fleeting moment, you imagine yourself as the ghost in the chronicles, the hand that shifted the course of kingdoms. Maybe you even picture a shadowy statue, somewhere deep in a candlelit alcove, commemorating your silent deed. Pause that fantasy, because the only thing getting immortalized is the client's plausible deniability, and your legacy is about to be erased faster than your last identity. Paranoia isn't just a job hazard, it's the air you breathe. Every glance is a threat. Every whisper at the inn could be another loose end. That legendary hit, the one you thought would echo through the ages, at best, it's a footnote buried under rumors. At worst, it's the reason there's a bounty on your head, and your former employer is now your biggest threat. Remember that client you imagined would honor your skill and loyalty? Of course you don't, because loyalty is a currency never accepted in this business. The moment your task is done, you transform from useful tool to ticking time bomb. You know too much names, motives, secret passageways, the color of the Duke's favorite slippers. Suddenly, the person who paid you is weighing the odds. Pay you and pray for your silence, or pay someone else to guarantee it. Spoiler, silence is cheaper when it's permanent. And oh, the betrayals. If you think the biggest threat to a medieval assassin is the city guard or a vengeful widow, you've clearly never met your own employer. The most common post-job perk is a knife in the back, delivered by the very people who gave you the job. Or, if they're feeling especially frugal, by someone who owes them a favor. There's no loyalty among thieves, and even less among those who hire them. There are even tales delightful, if you're into gallows humor, of contracts stacked like dominoes. One assassin is hired to kill the mark, another is hired to kill the assassin, and if the client's really feeling nervous, a third shadow is sent to watch the other two. It's like a medieval pyramid scheme, but the only payout is an unmarked grave. Let's say you anticipate the double cross. You try to blackmail your client, thinking you hold the upper hand. A bold move, and also your last medieval power brokers didn't negotiate with assassins. They didn't send letters, they sent problems. The kind that solved themselves with extreme prejudice. If you're lucky, you'll vanish quietly. If you're not, you become a cautionary tale, another shadow swallowed by the fog. And then there's the little matter of retirement. Spoiler alert, there isn't one. No plaque in the guild hall, no pension, no wistful toasts at the local alehouse. You don't get a cottage by the lake or a seat by the fire. You get perpetual exile, living under a name that isn't yours, in a town that doesn't want to know your business. Every day is a fresh audition in the grand theatre of pretending you've never killed a soul, You try to disappear. Maybe you grow a beard, develop a limp, start selling herbal remedies to superstitious peasants, but paranoia is your only true companion. Every knock on the door is a possible end. Every new face in the village square might be the last one you ever see. You sleep light if you sleep at all, always half expecting the tap of steel in the night. As for friends or romance, forget it. You can't trust anyone, least of all yourself. Years of lies, betrayals, and silent deaths have turned you into a ghost in your own skin. You don't laugh too loudly, never drink too deeply, and you always sit facing the door. You learn to love absence, because presence is dangerous. Let's rewind a bit. Maybe you imagine the assassin's life as a series of glamorous escapades, a swirling cloak, a hidden blade, a trail of whispered legends. But here's the reality. You're hungry, cold, and always one step away from disaster. You slip into a town, hood pulled low, only to find your target has skipped town. The guards are jumpy, and the informant you bribed is now ratting you out for a crust of stale bread. Everything is uncertain. The mud in the streets tries to claim your boots. Chickens block your escape route. And the only person who knows your face is a stable boy, still bitter. You never tipped him. You make a mistake, maybe freeze, maybe strike the wrong man, maybe get recognized by a kitchen maid who once saw you lurking near the chapel. Suddenly you're not a shadow. You're the problem. Now you run. But you're not some parkour legend. Medieval terrain is a brutal obstacle course. Uneven stones, ankle-breaking ruts, and alleyways that smell like the wrong end of a pig. The guards, one of whom is still smarting from a recent breakup, are eager for a distraction, and you're the perfect candidate. Let's say you survive, you find a place to hide, patch up your wounds, and try to forget the taste of fear. But the aftermath is always waiting. There are no allies, only people who want you gone. No one celebrates your work, and the only thing you earn is suspicion and the creeping certainty that you'll never truly be safe. You start to realize why the historical record is so full of forgotten assassins. Even if you succeed, your legacy is silence. No statues, no songs, no whispered toasts. If you get remembered at all, it's as a warning. Don't cross the wrong people, or you'll end up like Lord Ulrich, dead, and nobody quite sure who did it. Your only monument is absence. Your greatest achievement is to be a rumor, a shadow, a cautionary tale. If you get too bold, if your name is known, you become a loose end yourself. In this world, heroes are remembered, assassins are erased, and even if by some miracle you outlive your enemies and your clients, you never outlive the dread. The fear isn't just of discovery, but of the next ambitious assassin who's been handed a contract and a vague description that sounds a little too familiar for comfort. You change towns, change names, try to change your story, but the past sticks like mud on your boots. You stop dreaming, stop hoping, stop believing in anything but the next sunrise. You live half alive, a ghost wrapped in flesh and regret. The only thing waiting for you at the end is a quiet slip into obscurity. No one mourns and no one asks. So if you're still clinging to the idea of the assassin's life as a darkly glamorous calling, let me offer one last reality check. It's not romantic, it's not noble, it's not even profitable. It's a short, brutal career soaked in blood and anxiety, and the best you can hope for is to disappear so thoroughly that even your enemies forget you existed. You wouldn't last a week, you wouldn't even last a day. You'd show up with the wrong expectations, believing you're the master of shadows, when in reality, you're just another body waiting to be swept into the dustbin of history. No glory, no upgrades, no memorial. Just a slow fade into the kind of silence no one bothers to question. And that, my friend, is the assassin's true legacy. Paranoia, betrayal, and oblivion. Not a legend, but a warning. Not a hero, but a shadow that vanishes the moment the job is done. Of course, not everyone in the ancient world faded quietly into the background. Some people, through sheer ruthlessness, cunning, or a penchant for dramatic entrances, managed to carve their names into the stone of history, and not just as a rumour. Which brings us to our next subject. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympus was known as Myrtale, a Molossian princess from the rugged tribal lands of Epirus. Before she was the infamous queen of Macedon, feared, loathed, and whispered about in trembling tones, Olympus was just a girl named Myrtale, born among the wind-battered stones and wolf-haunted forests of Epirus. Her people insisted, with the kind of swagger only the truly desperate can muster, that they were descended from Achilles himself. You can almost picture the family reunions, a few grizzled cousins arguing over who inherited the best cheekbones from the hero of the Iliad, as if that would keep them safe from the knives of history. But whether or not the blood of Achilles flowed through her veins, one thing was obvious from the start. Olympias was never designed for the background. She didn't arrive on this earth to be a footnote or a pretty face at court, quietly weaving away her life while the men plotted and the gods looked on in boredom. No, Myrtale was forged in ritual and steeped in the kind of mystique that sticks to you like incense smoke. From her earliest days, her world was shadowed by prophecy, shaped by the ecstatic frenzy of ancient rites, and haunted by the belief that the gods themselves might at any moment reach down and rewrite the script. Forget the Hollywood princess, all silks and smiles. Try instead a barefoot figure, moonlit and wild-eyed, dancing among the priestesses of Dionysus. Picture her in the torchlit groves, flames flickering, the air thick with the hiss of sacred serpents and the pulse of drums, as women surrendered to divine ecstasy under the uncaring stars. Olympias didn't just worship the gods, she became a living conduit for them. Her connection to the divine wasn't some empty gesture for political effect, but something intimate, ferocious, and if you listen to ancient gossip, deeply unsettling. Ancient sources, almost all written by men who seemed equally terrified and infatuated, insist that she kept sacred snakes in her bedchamber. Yes, literal snakes, real, slithering, cold-blooded reminders that she was not here to play by the rules of polite society. Did she actually let them curl around her as she slept? Or was this just the kind of story that powerful women attract like flies? That's the perpetual riddle. Maybe it was true, maybe it was propaganda weaponized like a dagger in the dark. Either way, the legend stuck. To her friends, it made her seem chosen by the gods. To her enemies, it made her dangerous, unpredictable, almost inhuman. It's worth pausing here and asking yourself, if you were a rival, would you rather face a queen with a sharp tongue, or a queen who might unleash a pit of serpents at your feet? Olympias understood the value of mystique. Her real power didn't begin on a battlefield or in a marble throne room. It started in the smoky half-light, surrounded by whispers, veiled omens, and the writhing bodies of her sacred pets. She was a living oracle, someone touched by something older than politics and far colder than steel. You wouldn't last a week in her world. No perks, no crown, just a daily dance with danger and divinity. So when Philip II of Macedon, brutal, brilliant, and let's not mince words, famously horny, turned up on the sacred island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, fate was set for a collision. Most men came to Samothrace hoping for a blessing, or at the very least a new set of fashionable scars. Philip got more than he bargained for. He didn't just meet a beautiful princess, he found a living riddle. Their marriage wasn't some bland political arrangement. It was an earthquake, a collision of prophecy and power, the kind of union that sends priests scrambling for their best omens and poets sharpening their quills. And oh, the omens. On their wedding night, some said lightning split the sky. Others whispered that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt plunging into her womb, a celestial one-night stand, if you will. These stories would spiral into legend, embroidered and exaggerated with every retelling, until the line between fact and fantasy was as tangled as one of Olympias's sacred snakes. But the consequences were very real. Their union didn't just produce a child, it unleashed Alexander the Great, and Olympias was determined to shape his fate before he'd even drawn his first breath. Now, if you're imagining Olympias' marriage to Philip as some soft-focus romance, you've clearly never spent time in an ancient royal court. Macedon was less a kingdom and more a blood sport, where kings were often murdered by relatives before breakfast, and alliances shifted like sand underfoot. Philip, ruthless, magnetic, and already collecting wives like rare coins, tied the knot with Olympias around 357 BCE. She was probably in her teens, but don't mistake that for naivete. She saw in Philip not just a king, but a man whose ambitions might finally match her own, perhaps even a partner for her spiritual destiny. But Macedon was a shark tank. The air in Pella, the royal capital, practically vibrated with the sound of knives being sharpened and alliances being whispered in dark corners. Olympias, the priestess from Epirus, walked straight into this den of ambition. Head held high, eyes fixed on the crown, and one imagines a snake or two tucked metaphorically up her sleeve. From the outset, their marriage was less honeymoon and more powder keg. Philip, for all his military genius, was about as monogamous as a Dionysian revel. He continued to marry, mostly for political leverage, but always with an eye for advantage. Olympia's, however, was nobody's doormat. She built her own network, curated her own alliances, and kept a tight hold on her spiritual arsenal, consulting oracles, performing rites, and perhaps quietly plotting for the day when her son would need a clear path to the throne. Then came the birth of Alexander, and with it an avalanche of omens and portents. Legend claims Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt that set her womb ablaze without burning her, while Philip allegedly envisioned himself sealing her womb with a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Because why settle for boring symbolism when you can have a menagerie? Whether these dreams were genuine or retrofitted for the sake of propaganda, one thing is clear: both parents acted as if their child was destined to rule the world. The myth became strategy. Alexander wasn't just the son of Philip, he was the child of prophecy, untouchable, unchallengeable, practically divine. But even as the infant Alexander was celebrated, the royal marriage began to curdle. Olympias seethed over Philip's parade of wives, especially the Macedonian-born Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he wed later in life. This was no trivial domestic spat. Cleopatra's Macedonian blood meant that any son she bore would be seen as having a purer claim to the throne in the eyes of local nobility. In other words, Olympias' nightmare scenario. The palace wasn't just a home, it was a war zone, and Olympias wielded every scrap of superstition, every ritual, every whispered rumour like a weapon. By the time Alexander was a teenager, the royal palace in Pella had transformed into a seething nest of insults, backroom deals, and open animosity. Olympias wasn't just jockeying for influence. She was fighting for survival, both her own and her son's. In a world of snakes, she made sure she was the one teaching them how to bite. You, in her sandals, would have been eaten alive, or more likely, quietly dispatched and swept under a tapestry no one would ever bother to clean. Meanwhile, Philip grew distant, distracted by war, drink, and most insidiously, the honeyed advice of his Macedonian courtiers. The final insult? His marriage to the young Macedonian noblewoman, Cleopatra Eurydice. To Olympias, this wasn't just betrayal, it was an existential threat. The marriage feast became the stuff of palace legend, and not in the good way. Cleopatra's uncle, Attalus, Philip's favourite general, got drunk and couldn't resist taunting Olympias and Alexander, questioning whether Alexander was really Philip's son or the spawn of some god, just as Olympias liked to claim. It was meant as a slur, but Olympias, ever the strategist, turned the insult into a weapon. Let them whisper that her son was divine. It made him mythic, and in the treacherous logic of power, untouchable. The result? Alexander stormed out of the feast. Olympias didn't just leave in a huff, she fled Macedon entirely, retreating to her homeland of Epirus. But don't mistake this for surrender. Olympias knew that sometimes the most powerful move is to vanish just long enough for your enemies to destroy themselves. In Epirus, she remained a queen, free to gather allies, send messages, and watch Macedon's palace rot from the inside out. She didn't need to be present to be dangerous. Her absence was its own kind of poison. Then the palace exploded, figuratively, but not for lack of trying. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, just as he was poised to invade Persia and crown himself would-be emperor of the world. The question ricocheted through every marble hallway and shadowy corridor. Who did it? Was it Pausanias, the bitter bodyguard, some tangled court intrigue, maybe even Alexander himself? Or, whispered with the kind of fear reserved for vengeful gods, was it Olympias? No one dared say it aloud, but everyone thought it. Proof? There was none. But in the court of rumour, certainty is an afterthought. Within days of Philip's murder, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn daughter met an end so grisly that even the chroniclers flinched. The details vary: a forced suicide, a murdered infant, a funeral pyre. What's agreed upon is the message. Olympias didn't just eliminate her rival. She made it a spectacle, a warning carved into the memory of everyone in Macedon. In the ancient world, mercy was a liability, and rival children were ticking time bombs. Olympias was done playing defense. She erased the threat, root and branch. With her rivals removed and Macedon reeling, Olympias didn't hesitate. While others groped through confusion and grief, she moved with the precision of a serpent, swift, silent, and absolutely lethal. She orchestrated the deaths of Cleopatra and her infant, not as a private vendetta but as a public exorcism. Let the nobles blanch. Let the generals gossip. Olympias made it clear this was her son's throne now, and she would let nothing, absolutely nothing, stand in his way. Of course, Alexander himself wasn't always comfortable with his mother's scorched earth approach. He reportedly condemned the violence against Cleopatra's family, but tellingly he didn't stop it. Deep down he must have understood what Olympias had always known. Power in Macedon was written in blood, and bloodlines were both a blessing and a curse. With her son crowned, Olympias receded from the public glare, not into retirement, but into the shadows, the better to pull strings and whisper commands. As Alexander prepared for his world-conquering campaign, Olympias stayed behind in Macedon, the silent guardian of his destiny. She sent him sacred relics, consulted oracles, and performed rituals with the same fervor she'd always shown. To her, Alexander's war was more than a military mission. It was the fulfillment of prophecy, the realization of every snake-coiled vision and lightning-lit omen. As long as she lived, no rival, whether Macedonian, Persian, or anything else, would jeopardize that divine mission. Olympias had secured the throne, cleansed the palace, and crowned her child. Now she would become the fanged shadow at the edge of empire, a mother, a priestess, and the most dangerous woman in the ancient world. So before you start feeling smug about history's supposed happy endings, remember, in Macedon, there were no upgrades, no glory, and certainly no mercy for those who got in her way. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained behind in Macedon, but her story and her influence was far from over. In the next chapter, we'll see just how far the Queen Mother was willing to go to defend her legacy, and what it cost her in the end. So, here you are, Olympias, Queen Mother of Macedon. The throne has shifted beneath you, your son is off rewriting the maps of the world, and your official title is a polite fiction, Queen Mother. But don't kid yourself. This is not a sentimental honorific. You preside over Macedon with all the subtlety of a storm cloud. Antipater, the old General Alexander left to mind the kingdom, might have the regent's seal, but you have something far more potent, the power of myth, and a will sharp enough to cut marble. You write to Alexander, not as a doting parent, but as a field commander dispensing orders laced with prophecy, threats, and the occasional maternal scolding. These aren't the kind of letters anyone pins to the kitchen wall. No, your correspondence is a cocktail of omens and acid. Trust no one. Beware the men who smile too easily. And by the gods, Alexander, stop wearing those ridiculous Persian robes. Alexander reads every word. Who else would dare remind the living legend of his fallibility? You warn him of traitors in his camp. You question the loyalty of his oldest friends. You criticize his taste for foreign customs and his growing appetite for divinity. The world calls him a god king, but you're the only one who's ever changed his diapers, and you make sure he remembers it. No other voice pierces the imperial din like yours, equal parts priestess and mother, oracle and executioner. Meanwhile, back in Macedon, Antipater grows tired of your shadow. He might command armies, but you command whispers. Your influence stretches from your homeland of Epirus to the highborn circles of Thessaly, a network of favour and fear. You are the mother of Alexander, and if you choose to speak, the whole aristocracy strains to hear. Rumours move faster than cavalry, and with you, a rumour can be deadlier than a dagger in the dark. Your letters to Alexander grow more urgent. You paint Antipater as a would-be usurper, a second Philip lurking behind a smile and a legion of mercenaries. Maybe you believe it. Maybe you simply fear losing your grip. Either way, you keep pressing, warning your son that the old general is not to be trusted. Alexander hesitates. He needs Antipater to keep the Greeks in line while he's off conquering Asia. The rift between you and Antipater widens. You watch, you wait. You are not a woman who spent her youth surviving palace intrigue just to be outmaneuvered by a soldier with a bad haircut. You understand that Alexander's empire is growing too vast, his advisors too foreign, his sense of home too faint. You believe his victories flow from divine favour. your favor. And should he forget that, you'll remind him, even if the king you must humble is your own son. Then, in 323 BCE, the world cracks. Word arrives from Babylon, Alexander is dead. The news doesn't trumpet across the plains, it slips in like poison, quiet and cold. For you, it isn't just the death of a son. It's the collapse of an entire order, the shattering of decades of cunning, prophecy and blood. The storm you unleashed upon the world has been silenced. He leaves no clear heir, no fixed succession, only a fractured empire, already being carved up by his former lieutenants like vultures on a carcass. Antipater still rules Macedon with a grudge, and your daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, becomes a prize in the marriage market, courted by warlords desperate for a drop of the royal blood that might legitimize their ambitions. You see what's coming. Civil war is not some distant spectre, it's a certainty. With Alexander gone, all that remains of your power is his bloodline, his young son, Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess. The boy is both a target and a weapon, his very existence a challenge to every ambitious general from Pella to Persepolis. You move quickly, aligning yourself with Roxana and the child. Protecting them is as much pragmatic calculation as it is maternal instinct. The generals who once bent the knee now have their own armies, their own plans. They have no interest in ruling through a widow or a mother, but you are not easily cowed. You've stared down snakes, kings and traitors. You're not about to be frightened by a few arrogant men with borrowed crowns. You bide your time, plotting and watching as Antipater dies, replaced by his son Cassander, a man whose ambition is matched only by his iciness. Cassander has no nostalgia for the old queen's games. The stage is set for confrontation, the serpent mother against the cold-eyed usurper. Alexander is gone, but his myth lingers, and you Olympias are still coiled at its heart, ready to strike. Years pass. The empire unravels in endless civil war, each general carving out his own kingdom from the corpse of Alexander's dream. You wait for your moment, and at last it comes. You return to Macedon, not as a grieving matron, but as a storm in human form. Polyperchon, an aging general with a flicker of legitimacy, allies with you. You march into Macedon at the head of an army. The ground itself seems to shudder. Towns open their gates, soldiers defect. Even your old enemies hesitate. Despite your age, your name still carries the weight of thunder. Then comes the reckoning. You hunt down Cassander's loyalists with the precision of a priestess dispensing divine wrath. Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother and puppet king, is executed on your orders. His wife Eurydice is captured, offered the chance to take her own life, and when she refuses, you have her strangled. The brutality is dressed up as royal justice, Macedonian theatre at its finest. You want the world to know only the bloodline of Alexander has the right to rule. All others are usurpers. For a moment you hold the kingdom in your grasp, a moment as bright and brief as a flash of lightning. You have avenged the betrayals, restored the dynasty, reminded Macedon what happens when power is wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But Macedonian loyalty is flimsier than a reed in a storm. Cassander returns, his army larger, his resolve harder. Your allies melt away, Polyperchon fades into irrelevance. You are left isolated, besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna. The siege is relentless, food dwindles, disease creeps in, and the walls close around you like the coils of a serpent. You are cut off, alone, surrounded by Cassander's mercenaries. He offers you terms, surrender, and your life will be spared. But you've read enough royal promises to know better. Mercy is a lie, and the only thing more dangerous than a defeated queen is one who still breathes. Your forces falter. Hunger is not just a discomfort, it is the herald of death. Your last loyalists surrender, the fortress gates groan open, and you are handed over, not to Cassander himself, but to the families of those you executed. Let them decide your fate, Cassander decrees. He knows that killing you himself would make you a martyr, so he delegates the dirty work. Efficient, cold, and cowardly, but when the moment comes, something unexpected happens. Silence. Your executioners, Macedonians all, hesitate. They remember the rumours, the snakes, the rituals, the whispers that you are more than mortal. They grew up watching your son stride across the world like a demigod. Now, faced with you, older, diminished, but still cloaked in myth, they cannot lift their swords. You stand before them, regal and utterly still, your gaze fixed and implacable. The silence thickens, punctuated only by the shifting of feet and the creak of armor. No one dares strike the first blow. Cassander, realizing Macedonian courage has wilted in the face of legend, sends in foreigners, mercenaries with no memory of your power, only orders to follow. They complete the grim task. There is no ceremony, no dignity, just the dull finality of violence and the hush that follows. Your death is not a spectacle, it's a void, a hush that swallows the last ember of Alexander's house. Thus ends the line. With you gone, the last true hope of Alexander's bloodline fades into exile and obscurity. The empire that once blazed across continents is now a patchwork of petty kingdoms, ruled by men who will never inspire poetry or legend. But you Olympias leave behind more than bones. You leave a myth, a shadow that lingers in every tale of ambition and blood. History remembers you not as a victim, but as an architect of destiny. You wielded motherhood like a weapon and prophecy like a shield. You did not simply birth a conqueror. You forged him, cleared his path, and defended his legacy with every tool at your disposal, from royal marriages to whispered threats. Without you, Alexander is just another ambitious prince. With you, he becomes the thunderbolt, the godchild, the stuff of legend. Your power was never about armies or chariots. It was about belief in blood, in omens, in the terrifying certainty that destiny can be shaped by a woman's hand. Your enemies called you a witch, a murderer, a manipulator. They weren't wrong, but they weren't complete. You were all those things and more, a product of a world that rewarded cunning over compassion, and a survivor who learned early that mercy is for the weak. Centuries later, you are still being debated, villain or visionary, monster or matriarch. The answer is yes. You haunt the chronicles, a phantom queen always lurking at the edge of the legend, never merely a tragic mother or a footnote in someone else's story, but a story unto yourself, a woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, who slept beside serpents, who outlasted gods and kings alike. Your bones are dust, scattered and forgotten, yet your legend endures, hissing quietly in the background of every tale of ruthless queens and blood-soaked dynasties. You are the echo in every story of destiny, the whisper in every empire built on myth. Coiled in the darkness, you wait, because history never truly buries those who go down hissing. And speaking of legends rising from the dust, our journey now drifts south and east, across the wine-dark sea, to an island where myth and ruin are tangled as tightly as the coils of any serpent. On the sun-bleached island of Crete, just a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels more like a dream than a real place. If you thought Macedon was brutal and unromantic, wait until you see what happens when the gods themselves get lost in a labyrinth. Imagine this. You stand beneath the merciless Mediterranean sun on the island of Crete, your sandals crunching over dust older than legend itself. In the shimmering heat, ruins sprawl before you, broken pillars, crumbling walls, and corridors that wind like the trails of a fever dream. You are not in a palace so much as a waking hallucination. This is Knossos, the so-called heart of Minoan civilization, and the birthplace of a myth so tangled it still snares the unwary thousands of years later. Step inside. The stones themselves seem to shift beneath your feet. Corridors loop in every direction, some doubling back, others spiraling away into shadow. Rooms seem to multiply or vanish at will, and staircases promise escape only to deposit you in yet another maze of chambers. Even now, with tourist guidebooks and GPS, you can lose your bearings here. Imagine being an ancient visitor, confronted with a world of painted frescoes, echoing halls, and the ever-present sense that you might never find your way out. This is Knossos, the inspiration, so the story goes, for the legendary labyrinth. But before there was a monster, or a hero with a thread, there was simply a palace. Well, calling it a palace is a bit like calling the Colosseum an amphitheatre. Knossos was an entire city pressed beneath one sprawling roof. Built around 1900 BCE and constantly expanded, the complex eventually sprawled across nearly 150,000 square feet. That's more than 1,000 rooms, with light wells that pierced the gloom, storerooms stacked with ancient jars, shrines dense with incense and mystery, workshops humming with industry, and brace yourself, what may have been the world's first flushing toilets. Running water, multi-story living quarters, air shafts that kept the place cool long before the invention of ceiling fans. It wasn't a fortress, but an architectural marvel. To the modern archaeologist, Knossos looks like organized chaos. To someone from the Bronze Age, magic, or maybe a polite invitation to get hopelessly lost. Enter Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who, at the dawn of the 20th century, stuck his trowel into the soil of Crete and dragged Knossos into the modern imagination. Evans was immediately captivated, and who wouldn't be? The layout was bewildering, the frescoes practically dripping with symbolism, and everywhere the motif of the bull, bulls painted on walls, carved into stone, hammered into gold. The bull, sacred to the Minoans, became Evans's obsession. He was so swept up in the myth that he named the entire civilization after its legendary king Minos. And with that, history and legend knotted themselves together like so much tangled thread. But here's your first reality check. Despite a century of digging, no one has found a literal labyrinth underneath Knossos. No cleverly hidden underground maze, no prison built for a man-eating monster, no minotaur lurking in the shadows. What remains is, in some ways, far stranger. A city in loops, wings and layers. A structure that seems designed to bewilder. It's as if the architects wanted to blur the line between palace and puzzle, between civilization and confusion. The deeper you wander, the more the boundaries between history and myth dissolve. So ask yourself, was the Minotaur born from these walls, or was the palace itself the monster? Knossos doesn't hand over its secrets. It specializes in questions. The myth is as labyrinthine as the ruins themselves, a monstrous half-man, half-bull, imprisoned in a maze so intricate that escape was impossible. Only Theseus, the quintessential Greek hero, managed to slay the beast and find his way out, thanks to a ball of string and the quick wits of Princess Ariadne. Heroic, yes. But where did this story even come from, and why, of all things, a labyrinth? The earliest versions speak of King Minos, Lord of Crete, who demanded a grisly tribute from Athens, 7 boys and 7 girls, delivered yearly to feed the Minotaur. This creature, born of divine punishment and royal scandal, haunted the underground maze, a living symbol of everything savage and shameful, hiding behind royal grandeur. To the Greeks, Crete was more than just a big rock in the Mediterranean. It was a land of wealth, power, and eerie rituals. The Minoans, think elegant, mysterious, and a little terrifying, were famous for their bull-leaping games, their strange gods, and their palaces unlike anything found on the mainland. If you were a Greek from 1000 BCE, stepping into Knossos would be like wandering into another dimension. The bull stood at the center of it all. Minoan frescoes show young men and women vaulting over, charging bulls, not for sport, but as a sacred ritual. Rooftops and altars bristled with stylized bull horns, known as horns of consecration. Mix that with a palace that feels less like a royal residence and more like a fever dream, and you have the perfect recipe for a legend. But let's toss another twist onto the heap. What if the Minotaur wasn't just a monster? What if it was a metaphor for something far more real? Say the era when Crete dominated the Aegean and Athens was forced to pay tribute to a power both strange and overwhelming. Maybe the labyrinth is political, an image of entrapment of weaker states caught in the coils of Minoan supremacy. The Minotaur, then, is the raw, brute force behind that dominance. Or perhaps the whole myth is psychological. The labyrinth becomes the mind's shadowy interior, the Minotaur the beast lurking in our subconscious, and Theseus the part of us that dares to confront our darkest urges, armed with nothing but memory and the hope of escape. Still, the myth and the ruins remain hopelessly entangled, like a ball of thread dropped in the dark. Knossos is the closest thing archaeology has found to a real labyrinth, not a prison for monsters, but a palace so complex it swallows certainty. No Minotaur, no Ariadne, just a place whose mystery echoes louder than any legend. History here isn't content to stay factual, it demands to be myth, and myth, in turn, leaves behind ruins that dare you to decipher them. And so, as you stumble, blinking, back into the sunlight, you're left with more questions than answers. Did the palace birth the legend? Or did the legend shape our vision of the palace? Was the monster ever real, Or was the real monster the mystery itself? Knossos has never been interested in easy answers, but it's very, very good at making you wonder. Next, we're going to pull back from the twisting corridors and look at the civilization that built them. Long before Athens raised its marble temples or Sparta sharpened its spears, there was the Minoan civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in Europe. Step aside, Athens and Sparta. Before the Greeks even dreamed of democracy or hoplites, there was you, a Minoan. Picture yourself not as some spear-wielding hero, but as a trader, an artist, or perhaps a priestess gliding through sunlit corridors. Welcome to the Minoan civilization, Europe's original overachievers, thriving from around 2600 to 1400 BCE. Your kingdom is Crete, a lush island where olive groves and wildflowers creep down to turquoise shores, and where the sea is less a barrier than a superhighway for your ambitions. You don't conquer with swords. You conquer with saffron, pottery, and the kind of technological flex that would make even the Romans jealous. Your ships, sleek and silent, glide from port to port. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, even the faraway Spanish coast stuffed with cargo and stories. War is for the uncultured. You build relationships, not empires. You trade, you dance, you paint dolphins on your bathroom walls, and it works. Your people grow rich, not from plunder, but from the steady, seductive flow of commerce. No one is chiseling statues of you holding a spear. Instead, it's all flowing skirts, leaping bulls, and goddesses with serpents in their hands. And what a contrast you are to those macho Greeks who come after. Fast forward a few centuries, and the Hellenese will be carving tales of divine vengeance and blood-soaked heroes into marble. But you, your frescoes pulse with life, not death. Dolphin pods cavort above sunken bathtubs. Bare-breasted women twist in ecstatic dances. Men and women, indistinguishable in their athletic grace, hurl themselves over the backs of charging bulls. Your gods are not distant, bearded thunder-throwers. They're powerful, enigmatic women, their chests bare, snakes entwined in their fists, staring out with enigmatic calm. Fertility, transformation, protection, these are your obsessions. At the heart of your world is Knossos, not a fortress perched on some lonely crag, but a sprawling palace nestled in a valley, surrounded by fields and olive trees. Knossos, your masterpiece. It's not just a palace, it's a living, breathing organism. No massive defensive walls here. Either you feel so secure in your island's isolation that fortification is unnecessary, or maybe you've simply convinced everyone else it's not worth the trouble. Confidence. Thy name is Minoan architecture. Step inside. The place is gigantic, over 150,000 square feet, more than 1,000 rooms. Some tiny, some grand. Some are workshops where artisans shape clay and gold for export. Others are cool, shadowy storage chambers where jars of olive oil and wine stand in neat, endless ranks. There are apartments for the elite, shrines tucked into corners, and courtyards that explode with sunlight. There's no central axis, no straight lines. Corridors twist and double back on themselves. Stairs spiral down into darkness, or vault you up into blinding light. You turn a corner, and suddenly the world changes. A wall of vibrant blue dolphins leaps above your head. Another turn, and you're in a room lined with benches, facing an alabaster throne flanked by painted griffins. It's easy to see why visitors, ancient and modern, whispered of labyrinths. Here, the building isn't just a building, it's a riddle. It's alive, intentionally confusing, as if the architects wanted you to feel lost, to experience awe, to sense a presence lurking just beyond your reach. You, the Minoan, don't need a ball of thread to find your way. You have memory, instinct, and maybe a touch of divine guidance. Everyone else, good luck. This is less a palace and more a ritual machine, a place built to transform, disorient, and inspire. But don't mistake chaos for carelessness. Minoan design is clever, precise, and centuries ahead of its time. Cool air flows through hidden shafts. Light pours down into central halls. Rainwater is channeled through clay pipes into flushing toilets. Yes, you have indoor plumbing, while much of Europe is still poking around with sticks. The palace breathes with you, sheltering you from Mediterranean heat, funneling breezes, and washing away impurities. At the center is that so-called throne room, The seat itself is carved from alabaster, set into the wall, flanked by benches for an entourage. Griffins, mythical guardians, stare out from frescoes, their eyes fixed, their wings spread. Was this the seat of a king, a priestess, a living goddess? No one knows. There are no inscriptions spelling out anyone's name or deeds. Linear A, your written language, remains stubbornly undeciphered. The only thing scholars agree on is that whatever happened in this room, it was sacred. Power and mystery side by side. The walls all around you are alive with colour. No grim gods hurling thunderbolts. Instead, you see dolphins arcing over water, lilies curling in the sun, boys leaping fearlessly over bulls. The scenes are fluid, natural, and often ambiguous. Is the bull leaping an athletic competition, a sacrificial rite, a coming-of-age test, or just a really dangerous way to impress your friends? Whatever the answer, the bull is everywhere, painted on walls, carved into altars, represented in massive pairs of stylized horns that crown rooftops and sanctuaries. The animal is sacred, a symbol of both danger and renewal, of chaos mastered and life sustained. You don't fear the bull, you become it, if only for a moment. Hidden away in storerooms and shrines, you'll find the famous snake goddess figurines. Bare-chested, arms raised, serpents coiling about their bodies, they radiate something both maternal and terrifying. These aren't meek household idols. They command space. They protect. They embody fertility and the endless cycle of death and rebirth. For you, the snake is not an enemy. It's a symbol of renewal, a creature that moves between worlds, bringing secrets from earth and underworld alike. You tuck these goddesses into household shrines, quiet corners where the sacred seeps into everyday life, where prayers are whispered in darkness while the rest of the palace bustles above. The deeper you descend into Knossos, the more the palace seems to close in, the more the boundaries blur between the world of the living and the world of myth. Sometimes it feels as if the corridors are intentionally designed to confuse, to force you to slow down, to remember that you're trespassing in a place of ritual, not simply moving from one room to the next. Was this the inspiration for the labyrinth of legend? Not a prison for monsters, but a palace so complex and alive that it became a myth all its own. No minotaur, no locked doors, just the disorienting certainty that the walls themselves are watching, waiting, humming with secrets. For all its grandeur, you leave precious little behind for future generations to decipher. Linear A, your script, is a tantalizing riddle, its symbols still unreadable. No Rosetta Stone, no epic poems. What did you call yourselves? What did you believe? Who sat on the throne? And what prayers were spoken in the shadowed sanctuaries? No one knows. All that survives is your art, your architecture, and the echoes of your rituals, absorbed, distorted, and repackaged by the Greeks who came after. The Mycenaeans will borrow your palaces, your gods, your stories, replacing your flowing lines and bull dances with tales of war, vengeance, and blood. Your influence is everywhere, but your voice has vanished into the maze, and then suddenly it's over. For centuries, Knossos stands as a beacon, prosperous, innovative, alive with colour and song. But by around 1400 BCE, the palace is abandoned. The frescoes fade, the courtyards fall silent, and the Minoan civilization dissolves like morning mist over the Aegean. How? Why? That too is a mystery. The best minds have theories, but none bring closure. Some say nature turned against you. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, explodes in one of history's greatest eruptions. The sky darkens. Tsunamis smash Crete's northern coast, choking ports and farmlands under mud and salt. Ash clouds drift, blocking the sun, starving crops and perhaps strangling your trade networks. Knossos remarkably survives the blast. But the aftershocks, economic, spiritual, psychological, rip through your society. Others blame outsiders. By 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece are on the rise. Maybe they smell blood in the water. Maybe they just want what you have. Archaeological evidence suggests they move in, not with flaming swords, but with ledgers and scribes. The art changes, the vibe shifts. Linear A is replaced by Linear B, the Mycenaean script. The bull leapers and snake goddesses fade. replaced by a world obsessed with war and hierarchy. It's not a clean break, not a single conquest, more like a slow-motion takeover, first through trade, then influence, finally rule. There are whispers of internal strife too. Maybe your ruling elite fumbled. Maybe there was civil unrest, political collapse, or just the slow grinding weight of bad decisions. The best part? There's almost no evidence of violence, no burned bodies, no toppled walls, no massacre in the throne room. Knossos doesn't fall in a blaze of glory. It simply goes silent. The rituals end, the storerooms empty, and the wild flowers reclaim the courtyards. A civilization that once thrummed with life vanishes with barely a whimper. And there you have it. No heroic last stand, no epic tragedy, just the slow, quiet erasure that awaits even the most dazzling societies. By the time Homer starts singing about Crete, Knossos is already a legend, a half-remembered whisper tangled in stories of labyrinths and monsters. Maybe that's fitting. Maybe the real Minotaur is time itself, devouring all memory, all glory, until even your name is forgotten. But the bones of Knossos remain. The ruins hum beneath the soil, waiting for someone to listen. If you wander the maze today, you can almost hear the echoes, footsteps, laughter, a distant flute, the whisper of a snake goddess in the dark. The palace is still here, half alive, half dream, and the mystery endures, refusing to yield its secrets. So what comes next? For centuries, Knossos slept beneath the earth, its secrets locked away. But history has a way of resurfacing, doesn't it? In our next chapter, we'll follow the rediscovery, the symbolism, and the enduring mystery that still clings to these ancient stones. For thousands of years, Knossos lay buried beneath the Cretan soil. For more than 3 millennia, Knossos slept beneath the sun-baked Cretan earth, a forgotten tangle of stones, buried under waves of olive trees and centuries of silence. The world moved on. Empires rose, poets wrote, and the so-called cradle of civilization trundled along, blissfully unaware of the labyrinth lurking just out of sight. Names warped across generations, legends got chewed up and spat out by storytellers, and the walls themselves slipped into myth. No one cared, not until, inevitably, someone did. Enter, stage left, Sir Arthur Evans, the human embodiment of Victorian eccentricity, and the kind of archaeologist who wouldn't know subtlety if it bit him on the ankle. Evans was the sort of fellow who read Homer for breakfast and considered a good day's work to involve a little light myth-chasing. In 1900, this intrepid Brit strode into Crete, pockets bulging with cash and dreams, and promptly bought up the farmland sitting atop the ruins. Local farmers had been stumbling over odd little seals and trinkets for years, blissfully unaware that their olive trees drank from the bones of an ancient palace. But Evans, he smelled a story. He wanted to dig up a legend, armed with shovels, a taste for drama, and a suspiciously romanticized view of Greek myth. Evans began to peel back the earth. What he unearthed wasn't just another ruined villa or a pile of boring pottery shards. No, Knossos erupted from the dust, a palace so sprawling, so intricate, that even Evans was forced to admit he might have bitten off more labyrinth than he could chew. Endless corridors, frescoes dripping with colour, horns and axes peeking out from every alcove. It was as if the myth had been waiting, crouched beneath the soil, just for him. And like any good Victorian, Evans didn't just excavate, he interpreted, he reimagined. He spun stories as quickly as he shoveled dirt, building a narrative where the ruins themselves left only silence. Evans dubbed the builders of Knossos the Minoans, after the legendary King Minos, as if naming them could conjure their ghosts back from oblivion. He saw labyrinths in every hallway, minotaurs lurking in every shadow, and the gods of myth flickering just beyond the reach of his trowel. The palace, in his telling, wasn't just a home for royalty, it was the birthplace of the labyrinth, the cradle of the myths that haunted the Greeks for centuries. And when the ancient walls proved too battered by time, Evans did what any self-respecting Edwardian would do. He poured concrete over the past, literally. Restorations rose up. Not always faithful, sometimes fanciful, always controversial. Was he rescuing history or steamrolling it? Depends on who you ask. Some call Evans a visionary, others mutter vandalism under their breath. Either way, there's no denying it. Today, Knossos is equal parts Bronze Age relic and Edwardian fever dream, but let's give Evans credit where it's due. He did what no one else dared. He forced Knossos out of hiding, dragged it into the daylight, and demanded that we look. Thanks to him, Europe glimpsed a civilization older than Athens, stranger than Troy, a kingdom of elegance, art, and sea-born mystery. In the process, Evans stumbled upon Linear A, a script that remains stubbornly undeciphered, a cruel little joke from history to all those who thought they'd finally cracked the code. Every tablet, every etched mark, is a locked door we still can't open. Language, literacy, and the limits of our knowledge, all laid bare by a few scratches on clay. But Evans wasn't just an archaeologist with a penchant for concrete. He was a myth-maker, reviving a legend that had drifted into bedtime story territory. He forced academia to confront an uncomfortable truth. Behind the fairy tales and monster stories was something real, something complex, and surprise, something unromantic. The palace was no simple labyrinth. It was a microcosm of a civilization we barely understand. It wasn't all glory and heroics. It was politics, ritual, and the slow grinding march of daily life. Knossos had slept for thousands of years, but Evans rang the bell that woke it loud enough for the world to hear. Now fast forward to you, wandering the ruins in the present day. You're not just traipsing through an archaeological site, you're pacing through a language of symbols, painted and carved and half lost to time. Frescoes burst with colour, dolphins leap, lilies bloom, birds wheel across plaster. The walls hum with patterns, swirls, spirals, and the ever-present bull. But don't get cocky, there's no Rosetta Stone here. The Minoans were considerate enough to leave us Linear A, but not considerate enough to make it readable. So you have to play detective, piecing together meaning from images that refuse to explain themselves. What did they mean, these dazzling paintings and cryptic carvings? Well, let's burst another bubble. Minoan art is shockingly unconcerned with war. No lines of spear-wielding heroes, no grand scenes of conquest. Instead, the walls are alive with nature, dolphins, flowers, and ritual dancers caught mid-leap. The humans here don't look like world conquerors, they look like they're attending the world's most stylish party. Even when danger lurks, a bull charging, a ritual in progress, everything pulses with rhythm and beauty. The Minoans, it seems, chronicled not their battles but the cycles of life, birth, death, the turning of seasons and the cosmic dance. Their art is a celebration, not a eulogy. But if there is one symbol that towers above the rest, it's the double axe, the labyrinth carved, painted, and etched into every corner of Knossos. This blade isn't about hacking through enemies, it's believed to be a religious emblem, perhaps tied to female divinity or the cycles of the stars. Some even whisper that the very word labyrinth comes from labyrinth, making Knossos not a maze but a house of the double axe, a sacred space, not a prison. Then there's the ever-present horns of consecration, those stylized bull horns perched atop walls and altars. Maybe they marked the boundary between sacred and mundane, maybe they just looked cool. Either way, the bull was central. Nature, chaos, fertility, the divine. It's all up for grabs, and the experts still squabble over what it meant. Even the palace itself, with its winding corridors and confusing floor plan, might be more than a practical joke played on future tourists. Some archaeologists argue that Knossos was designed as a spiritual journey in stone, a map of the cosmos, a walk through life and death, a symbolic maze rather than a physical one. But here's your regular dose of reality, without a deciphered script. Every theory teeters on the edge between insight and imaginative fan fiction. The Minoans spoke in colour, in pattern, in rituals. They left us riddles, not answers. So you wander Knossos, eyes drinking in the frescoes, feet echoing down corridors built before Rome was a twinkle in anyone's eye. The meaning dances just out of reach, always one step ahead. The ruins are ancient, yes, but they refuse to die. You can feel it, the thrum beneath the stone, the residue of old myths and older questions. Not ghosts, not gods, but a persistent hum of memory. Tourists mill through, archaeologists dig and argue, writers spin new tales from the dust. The Minotaur is a legend, but the sensation of being lost in a maze? That's real. You're living it right now. No one remembers the names of Knossos' kings, queens, or high priests. No one knows the prayers they whispered or the laws they obeyed. But we know this. They loved beauty, they worshipped nature, and they understood the delicate balancing act between art and architecture, ritual and reality. Before the Parthenon, before Rome flexed its marble muscles, before the Hebrew temples and Persian palaces, there was Knossos, a palace that was also a city that was also a temple that was also a story. Maybe the labyrinth was never a prison or a puzzle, but a myth carved in stone, a narrative you walk through, not one you solve. The legend of the Minotaur didn't spring from thin air. It grew from Knossos itself, from the confusion of its corridors, the reverence of its bulls, the awe that radiates from its stones. The Greeks crafted a myth. We in turn built an archaeology. But at the core, Knossos defies both. Even today, you can walk its halls, snap your photos, draw your maps, but the mystery clings like heat in the air. The line between fact and legend flickers, refusing to stand still. And maybe, just maybe, that's why Knossos endures. It doesn't answer your questions. It reminds you that sometimes history isn't a puzzle to be solved, but an experience to be felt. Knossos, ancient, tangled, half-remembered, isn't merely a site on a tourist map. It's a question, a challenge, a seductive riddle that pulls you deeper the longer you linger. Like Theseus, you find yourself following the thread, knowing full well the way out is never quite what you imagined. But don't get too comfortable in your labyrinthine reverie, because while Knossos asks questions in stone, ancient engineers elsewhere were busy posing answers in the form of battering rams, catapults, and the glorious physics-defying trebuchet. If you think myths are mysterious, just wait until you see what happens when history decides to get innovative, with a little help from gravity and a lot of misplaced optimism. Ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing. Let's get one thing straight. Ancient engineers weren't bumbling around with sticks and wishful thinking. They were methodical, ruthless, and most importantly, they knew how to turn a tree trunk into the stuff of nightmares. Picture yourself as a grunt in the earliest days of siege warfare. You and your sweaty companions hauling a stripped log, bellowing like deranged lumberjacks as you crash it again and again against a city's gate. No finesse, just brute force and a prayer that your arms don't give out before the wall does. But as with all things, innovation soon reared its clever head. Enter the next stage, the battering ram, now with upgrades. Engineers, never satisfied with mere exhaustion, encased the ram in a wheeled shelter, often topped with a roof to shield the crew from arrows, rocks, or, you guessed it, boiling oil. You're no longer just a sweaty human sledgehammer, now you're a rat under a wooden shell, inching your rage machine toward a wall while defenders above plot your demise. The Assyrians, those connoisseurs of misery, perfected this art. Their rams rolled forward with the patience of doom itself, iron-tipped and unstoppable, while archers let loose death from atop combined siege towers. Imagine the gates splintering beneath you as arrows rain down. Your only comfort, the rhythmic pounding and the knowledge that surrender is the only alternative to utter ruin. Relief carvings from Nineveh don't show glorious heroes. They show these rams as slow, relentless gods of devastation, creeping up to rebellious cities with all the subtlety of divine retribution. Rams weren't just for the front door either. Weak wall sections, watchtowers, anything that looked like it might offer hope. All fair game. The message was simple and universal. Yield, or watch your defences collapse like a stale loaf dropped from a rooftop. The Greeks, never ones to leave well enough alone, refined the design. The Romans, with their trademark flair for efficiency and scale, turned it into an industrial operation. Their massive Ares rams, named after the ram, naturally were suspended by ropes or chains inside enormous wooden housings. Some of these bad boys needed dozens of men to operate, swinging in a thunderous cadence that echoed across the stones like a storm closing in. If you ever wondered what teamwork meant in ancient times, try coordinating a dozen exhausted men as they dodge burning pitch and rotting garbage hurled from above. A ram that stalled was a ram that died, and by extension, so did your hopes of surviving the day. But then, if the ram was the bruiser, the catapult was the tactician. Rams worked up close, but the catapult brought death from a distance. Forget the Hollywood image of a single heroic boulder arcing gracefully over the wall. Real catapults launched not just rocks, but pure psychological warfare. For the first time, defenders had to worry about the sky. The earliest catapults burst onto the scene in the Greek world during the 4th century BCE, a result of intellectuals deciding that flinging things by hand simply wasn't dramatic enough. Enter Dionysius of Syracuse, a tyrant with a penchant for showy violence. He commissioned the very first torsion-powered catapults, devices that harnessed twisted bundles of animal sinew or human hair as springs. We're not talking slingshots for giants, we're talking precision siege engines, the kind that made defenders consider a career change. The mechanics were equal parts genius and lunacy, by twisting ropes absurdly tight, sometimes using the sinews of the very animals you'd rather be eating. Engineers stored up a monstrous amount of potential energy. Release the tension and you could launch stones, javelins, or flaming pitch hundreds of meters. Two main types dominated: the ballista, firing bolts like a crossbow on a protein binge, and the stone-throwing catapult, lobbing boulders over walls or directly at their faces. The Romans, ever the overachievers, took these Greek blueprints and made them mobile. Their war machines could be broken down, carted across continents, and reassembled at your doorstep. They even had models that could hurl 60-pound stones at terrifying speeds, enough to take out gates, battlements, or the luckless soul who happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But catapults weren't just about the physics of destruction, they were about spectacle. Ancient generals were the original performance artists of terror. Sometimes, catapults flung not stones but corpses, diseased, rotting, and guaranteed to shatter morale faster than any chunk of granite. Severed heads sailed through the air, trailing psychological devastation. If you ever thought medieval warfare was all heroics and chivalry, think again. One particularly enterprising commander even used catapults for early biological warfare, launching plague-ridden bodies into besieged cities. Not what you'd call a Geneva Convention moment. Of course, catapults had their drawbacks. They were massive, needed skilled crews, and could be rendered useless by bad ground or incompetent assembly. But set up right, they could pound a city into submission from a safe distance. The message was clear: your walls are no longer your sanctuary. Now the very sky has turned against you. Every crash of stone, every grotesque projectile, was a reminder that nowhere was safe. The first artillery in history didn't just break down walls, they broke spirits. And then, just when defenders thought the arms race couldn't get any worse, along lumbered the trebuchet, the king of siege engines. If the catapult was clever, the trebuchet was pure, ponderous majesty, towering above the battlefield, creaking and groaning with every movement. It announced itself as the undisputed monarch of medieval siegecraft. When a trebuchet appeared, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a declaration: your vaunted walls are as effective as a sandcastle before the tide. Unlike its torsion-powered cousins, the trebuchet relied on gravity and counterweights. At its heart, a long arm mounted on a sturdy frame, with a massive weight on one end and a sling on the other. When you raised that weight and let it fall, the arm whipped around, catapulting its deadly cargo in a soaring arc over the enemy defences. Controlled, predictable, devastating. The earliest traction trebuchets, powered by teams of sweaty soldiers, showed up in China as early as the 4th century BCE. But the true power arrived with the counterweight trebuchet, which exploded onto the European scene in the 12th century, possibly courtesy of Byzantine or Muslim engineers. Once medieval Europe got its hands on the design, it spread faster than a rumour at a royal banquet. The physics were nothing short of awe-inspiring. A well-built trebuchet could launch a 300-pound stone more than 300 metres. Imagine a wardrobe-sized boulder crashing down, not just shattering walls but obliterating morale. And here's the real kicker. Trebuchets didn't just smash the walls, they reached over them. They could drop their payloads deep inside a city, crushing barracks, setting supply depots ablaze, or reminding cowering defenders that nowhere was safe. Their arsenal was limited only by the depths of human nastiness. Diseased animals, flaming pitch, pots of lime to blind, even letters or insults tied around rocks. If you wanted to send a message, a trebuchet delivered it. Express, postage paid in terror. One infamous example? The legendary Warwolf at the siege of Stirling Castle. This trebuchet was so enormous, so intimidating, that the defenders tried to surrender before it even fired. The king, in an act of royal pettiness, refused the surrender. He wanted to see the beast in action. The result? A demonstration of power so overwhelming it became legend, and not in a flattering way for the defenders, but even kings have to wait. The trebuchet, for all its glory, wasn't fast. It took days to construct, minutes to reload, and a team of specialists to operate. You didn't just slap one together on a whim, but no other weapon combined spectacle, range, and psychological horror so perfectly. When that counterweight dropped, it was as if the heavens themselves had declared war on your walls. The air would fill with the groan of wood, and the whir of the sling, and then silence, anticipation, dread, until the stones began to fall. So in the grand theatre of siege warfare, the battering ram was the brute, the catapult tactician, and the trebuchet the king, each engineered to batter not just stone, but the very spirit of those who hid behind it. If you thought defending a city meant hiding safely behind walls, think again. These engines of war turned every siege into a performance, one where fear was as deadly as stone, and surrender was often the only encore. But don't relax just yet. While rams crashed through gates and trebuchets hurled horror from afar, some siege engineers decided that the best way in was up, over, or even under. In the next chapter, we'll get up close and personal with the rise of siege towers, the dark art of tunneling, and the desperate defensive tricks that shaped the legacy of siege warfare. Because if you thought the sky was terrifying, wait until you see what's coming from ground level. Let's set the mood. You're perched atop a city wall, sweat pooling between your shoulder blades, the taste of fear metallic on your tongue. Somewhere out on the plain, a shape lurches into view, a lumbering, groaning behemoth of timber and iron, trundling forward on wheels slick with mud. This isn't a fever dream or a deleted scene from a fantasy epic. This is the arrival of the siege tower, history's answer to the question, what if you built a multi-story house, filled it with angry men, and pointed it at someone else's front door? The siege tower is not interested in subtlety. Imagine a colossal boxy monolith, creaking with every revolution of its wheels, draped in sopping wet animal hides to stifle the ambitions of would-be arsonists. Archers and spearmen glower through arrow slits, itching for the first shot. The entire contraption is less an engineering marvel than a rolling declaration of intent, an armoured personnel carrier and mobile fortress stitched together by desperation and bravado. You can thank the Assyrians for the originals, but it was the Greeks and later the Hellenistic kingdoms who cranked up the spectacle. In 305 BCE, Demetrius the Besieger, never one for understatement, rolled up to the siege of Rhodes with a 9-story monstrosity called the Helepolis, literally taker of cities, over 100 feet tall, bristling with catapults, sheathed in iron plates, and powered by the sweat and terror of thousands. It collapsed under its own ambition. But the point was made. Sometimes, excessive confidence is its own kind of weapon. The logic is as old as the first stone wall. If you can't smash through, just go over. Towers offered a vertical solution to a horizontal problem. From the top deck, your archers could pepper the ramparts with arrows, while troops huddled below, waiting for the moment the gangplank would crash down onto the battlements. Suddenly, the defenders' hard-won elevation becomes a two-way street, and the walls they built to keep you out become the bridge you use to break in. But if you're picturing these towers as invincible juggernauts, Hollywood has set you up for disappointment. Siege towers were slow, ponderous, and stunningly vulnerable to every dirty trick the defenders could muster. Rain turned siege fields into quagmires, mud left towers mired and useless. Defenders greeted them with fire arrows, rolling boulders, and the occasional perfectly timed landslide. If you were particularly unlucky, your enemies would have flooded moats or dug hidden ditches, turning your glorious assault into a slow-motion disaster. Sometimes, a single misstep meant your mighty tower tipped and crashed, spilling soldiers like dice from a cup. Yet, when the stars aligned and a siege tower did reach the walls, it could unleash absolute pandemonium. One moment, the parapet is a line of stoic defenders. The next, it's a melee of swords, screams, and splinters. The battlefield is no longer a flat expanse. It's a vertical hell, a contest for every inch of stone. The moment the gangplank slams down, there's no going back. Welcome to hand-to-hand limbo, with zero perks, and even less glory. While your attention is fixed on the noisy spectacle above ground, let's duck below the surface to the unsung, unseen world of siege tunneling. If siege towers are the rock stars of medieval warfare, sappers are the roadies, dirty, exhausted, and almost universally unappreciated. The concept is simple, the execution pure nightmare fuel. You dig beneath the enemy's wall, prop up the tunnel with wooden beams, then torch the supports. Watch as the earth groans, the timbers splinter, and the foundation of the wall gives way. One heartbeat, your city stands proud. The next, a yawning breach where solid masonry once loomed. Forget fanfare. Tunneling is the silent assassin of siegecraft. No grand machines, no thunderous launches. Just the slow, methodical scrape of pickaxes in the dark, and the knowledge that at any moment the wrong sound could mean a tunnel collapse. The Assyrians dabbled early, but the Greeks, Persians, and later the medieval armies brought the dark art to its full, terrifying potential. Take the siege of Plata in 429 BCE. The Spartans, never ones to skip a shortcut, try to undermine the walls. The defenders, not to be outfoxed, dig their own counter-tunnels, leading to a surreal subterranean knife fight in the black. Picture it, you're crawling on your belly, torch sputtering, ears straining for the telltale scratch of enemy steel. Suddenly, the wall bursts open, and you're face to face with an equally filthy, equally desperate foe. Forget glory, this is panic, claustrophobia, and the very real possibility of being buried alive. This grim little dance is called countermining, and it's about as fun as it sounds. If you were lucky, you intercepted the enemy sappers before your wall collapsed. If not, well, read up on Rochester Castle, 1212. King John's men tunnelled beneath the southern tower, packed the mine with pig fat, and set the whole thing ablaze. The supports collapsed, and the tower above came crashing down. The defenders, shocked and demoralised, surrendered soon after. There's no heroism in being outwitted by a man with a shovel and a barrel of lard, but history rarely hands out medals for dignity. By the 13th century, siege engineers had become a breed apart, part geologist, part demolitionist, all madmen. They learned to read the earth, spot weak foundations, and orchestrate collapses with clinical precision. If you couldn't go over the wall, and you couldn't go through it, there was always the option to swallow it from below. But attackers weren't the only ones getting creative. For every ram or tower rolling forward, defenders had their own arsenal of homegrown horrors. Some, like Greek fire, were the stuff of nightmares. Developed by the Byzantines in the 7th century, Greek fire was a secret recipe for medieval napalm, a sticky, burning concoction that clung to hulls, walls, and flesh, and kept burning even on water. Sprayed from siphons or lobbed in clay grenades, it could turn entire fleets into floating bonfires in minutes. The recipe was so closely guarded, it died with the empire, but the terror it inspired outlived its makers by centuries. For those defenders without an imperial chemistry set, there were always the classics: boiling water, oil, or sand. Forget the quaint image of a knight heroically scaling a ladder. Imagine the moment his world erupts in a shower of scalding liquid, or a rain of burning oil that soaks into his armour and sets him alight. Hot sand, less flashy but arguably more sadistic, slipped through armour gaps, burrowing into flesh and leaving 2nd and 3rd degree burns in its wake. It wasn't all about temperature and pain, though. Defenders weaponized gravity with an almost gleeful abandon. Giant stones, logs, and if you were feeling particularly theatrical, dead animals rained down from the parapets. The aim wasn't just to kill, it was to crush morale, shatter siege engines, and remind your enemies that sometimes the laws of physics are on your side. And then there were the traps, hidden pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades. But let's not kid ourselves. Raw destruction was only half the story. The real siege played out in the mind. Siege engines, from towers to trebuchets, weren't just weapons, they were psychological torture devices. Every creak of a tower's wheel, every boulder arcing slowly through the sky, was a message: you are not safe. The Assyrians understood this. They paraded their siege engines with the theatricality of a Vegas showman, letting defenders watch as death was assembled piece by piece. The Romans built siege camps within sight of the walls, so you could enjoy the spectacle of your own impending doom. Siege was theatre, and the audience was always unwilling. Sometimes, the payload itself sent a message. Severed heads, sometimes still in their helmets, launched over the walls. At Constantinople, the defenders faced not only stones, but the mangled remains of their own. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, plague-ridden corpses were lobbed over the battlements. Some historians even argue this helped propel the Black Death across Europe. The trebuchet wasn't just a weapon, it was a loud, stinking, infectious announcement. Those inside the fortress could hear the threat before they saw it. The groan of the winch, the whine of the ropes, the heavy, inevitable thunk of the counterweight, each sound a drumbeat of dread. Sometimes it wasn't the noise, but its absence that unstrung nerves. A sudden hush as engineers made adjustments, the pregnant silence before the next volley. Even sound became a weapon, each rhythmic thud gnawing away at the defenders' resolve. For the commanders, it was all about despair. Convince the enemy they were already beaten, that their gods had abandoned them, that their walls, those monumental testaments to human hubris, were nothing but speed bumps on the road to conquest. When that mental dam finally broke, often the gates would swing open without a fight. In siege warfare, the mind collapsed before the masonry did. Then came the thunder of gunpowder. By the late medieval era, the grand old engines fell silent, replaced by the shattering roar of cannons. One well-aimed cannonball could do in a heartbeat what a trebuchet might accomplish in a day. Once impenetrable stone walls became crumbling relics, liabilities rather than lifelines. The 15th century saw Europe's castles and city walls splintered not by brute force, but by the cold logic of ballistics. But make no mistake, the core lessons of ancient siege warfare didn't vanish with the trebuchet. Modern artillery, rockets, and even the humble mortar are all descendants of those first attempts to break the unbreakable. The math of trajectory, the harnessing of tension, the relentless pursuit of weak points, these are the fingerprints of history, smudged across every battlefield from antiquity to today. Even now, the psychological gamesmanship endures. Shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, the theatrical display of might. These are the direct heirs of those monstrous towers rolling towards city walls, banners snapping in the wind. The message hasn't changed. We are coming, and you can't stop us. You can still read the echoes of siege warfare in the bones of old cities. At Masada, Roman siege ramps scar the sand, silent testimony to patience and persistence. In Constantinople, the battered remains of centuries-old walls stand as stubborn reminders of 1,000 failed assaults. Across Europe, castle ruins tell the story of a continent in perpetual redesign, scrambling to outwit the next siege. And in the modern world, sieges haven't disappeared, they've just gone digital. Cities are encircled not by armies but by firewalls, blockades, or information blackouts. The names have changed, but the dance remains. Someone wants in, someone wants to keep them out, and both are willing to wait, starve, and break each other to win. So yes, the battering rams are museum pieces, and the trebuchets are Instagram props. But the spirit of siege warfare, the stubborn, ruthless contest of will and ingenuity, is very much alive. The only thing that's changed is the shape of the walls.